Additionally, VNPC's Turn the Page digital storytelling project will be hosting a provider-focused workshop starting in July. So if you're a maternal health provider or you know one who would like to share a story that has impacted them or the way they provide care, we would love to hear from them and talk with them. We're having an info session if they'd like to learn more about the process. That will be on May 23rd. And I will share the link to register that in the chat, as well as the link to the interest form if you'd like to submit, and let us know that you'd like to be a part of that. Our next regular monthly webinar will be next Tuesday, May 21st at noon. And the topic for that webinar will be stress injury and trauma-informed care related to labor and delivery patients. Our other webinar series to look out for are maternal and infant health data series. The third part of that series will be on June 11th. This is the last part of this series, as I just mentioned, but you can find the recording for this one and all the others on the VNPC's YouTube page. I'll drop a link for that as well. And then also look out for our upcoming special webinar series on perinatal mental health safety starting in August. And now I'll introduce our speaker, Stephanie Henriques, who uses the pronouns she, her, ea. She is based in New York. She's a psychotherapist, social services strategist, youth advocate, and birth justice activist. She's a certified birth doula, childbirth educator, and lactation counselor. So I will turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Tiffany, and thank you for having me today to talk about this very important topic. So I have a lot of information for us to kind of cover today. I'm excited to share this. There will be time for questions at the end of my presentation today. So here we are, untangling the tentacles of intersectionality. So this is the beginning to a broader conversation that is led by me. Here we go. And Tiffany thankfully read my bio. So yes, my name is Stephanie Henriques. I am a licensed social worker, currently working as a psychotherapist. All right, so these are the goals for today's presentation. We're going to talk about we're going to get some foundational language around race and anti-racism to kind of build fluency. There's a pretty heavy topic about race as it is the cornerstone of some of the things that we're talking about today. We're going to talk about, there is a chronology of medical racism, which also applies to other identities that we will identify and talk about today. And then we're going to talk about actionable tools that can be used in service of justice. So my goal for you today is to leave our conversation with a clear sense of the connection between the intersectionality of identities, the impacts of systems of oppression and disparities in healthcare, and a pathway forward for you to continue your learning journey and moving into the space of activism through your work. So why the focus on intersectionality? I'm intentionally focusing on the intersectionality of race and health disparities. Race is the #1 indicator that leads to identifying disparities related to birth for babies and birthing people. Talking about race and gender-related topics is sometimes uncomfortable and it can be triggering. These topics like chattel slavery, gender transition, human trafficking, and medical bias, for example, are embedded in our history, and so they'll be included in today's presentation. I invite you to actively engage in today's conversation, leaning into the discomfort where you can, and ensuring that you're also taking care of yourself in whatever way is best for you. So if you need to go off camera, if you need to step away for a bit, I'm totally fine with that. But I hope that you will invite yourself back in and just take note of what's coming up for you. All right, so let's talk about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a theoretical framework. Oh, before I continue, you will notice that throughout my presentation today, you will see pictures of books, or there are little boxes that have words next to them where you can hover over them, and those are topics that you can search. I will share those at the end of my presentation today, but these are some of the places where I have drawn from some of my work and things that I hope that you will look up and be interested about in your own exploration and learning. Intersectionality is a theoretical framework that examines how multiple social identities, such as race, gender, sexuality, class, ability, religion, spirituality, etc., intersect and interact to produce unique experiences of discrimination, marginalization, and privilege. Intersectionality recognizes that individuals have multiple identities that cannot be ranked or separated, and that these identities intersect to produce complex and nuanced experiences. Not only does intersectionality create nuanced experiences, it compounds the impacts of other systems of oppression, such as racism, sexism, phobia, transphobia, ableism, and classism. Some of these examples can include intersecting oppressions, like a Black woman who is experiencing both racism and sexism as a woman who is Black, right? Greater marginalization and exclusion. Queer people or a queer person with a disability may face homophobia, ableism, and then discrimination based upon their disability. Erasure and invisibility. We see bi-erasure or trans erasure sometimes in LGBTQ+ spaces. There's also internalized oppression, which is oppression that can lead people to have internalized self-doubt or shame, and also the perpetuation of stereotypes and biases. By understanding how these systems of oppressions impact intersectionality, we can better address and dismantle these systems to create a more inclusive and equitable society. So let's talk about race. Race is a social construct. It's a broadly shared understanding based on shared assumptions held by the author and their primary audience. All right, so if it's just a social construct, then why is this definition important? While race was socially constructed, it has very real implications, right? Specifically, race was constructed to distinguish differences and create racial hierarchy, and thus creating a system for oppression based upon race or racism. These categories reinforced already existing beliefs. The categories of race have continued to evolve based upon the needs of those who created the system and remain in control of it. And here in the United States, this provided a moral basis for the genocide of Indigenous peoples, the enslavement of Africans, and later policies and laws that further subjugated Black and Indigenous and disabled communities in particular. All right. So let's talk about bias. So power structures and identity are often structures which people are discriminated against based on the belief that either race or gender of the group being discriminated against is inferior, right? So we have it at an individual level, and then we have it at a systemic level, right? So here I'm talking about racism, but that can easily be exchanged for transphobia or homophobia, right? So we have interpersonal racism, which is racism that is in between individuals and an interpersonal in communication or action. This can be direct or overt. It can be subtle or indirect, and in the form of microaggressions, right? There's internalized racism. Racism is at the individual level that manifests in private beliefs or biases about race and racism influenced by our culture. We also see it at a systemic level, right? So we have institutional racism, which is the systemic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity in our society to people who benefit, who are white, and at the exclusion of people of color, right? So we've seen this reflected in the housing system, where certain housing contracts, such as restrictive covenants, and big lending policies, such as redlining, are forms of institutional racism. We also see this happen in the criminal justice system through racial profiling by security and law enforcement workers. And we also see it in the employment system, barriers to employment or professional advancement based on race, right? Then we have structural racism, which is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It's a feature that's built within the social and economic political systems in which we all exist. This leads to dimensions in our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. I think it's important to recognize that race is it is well documented, right? Through, as we can see through a number of these different policies and different levels that racism exists. But again, like I said, it exists not only in power structures, but also in different identities. All right, so to be clear, race is the largest indicator of disparities in healthcare. And that's because you can see it, right? Like there are oftentimes things that identities that people live or wear, right? That might not be visually, that someone might not be able to see, right? You can't really hide your race. But here are some areas where intersectionality are at play, right? So right down here at the bottom, we have the systems of oppression. So we have white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, and caste systems, right? And through these systems of oppression are represented by these ideologies and these institutions of oppression. So nationalism, religion, dominion law enforcement, healthcare, prison, military, media, farming, reservations, corporations, education, government, right? And then as you see these leaves up here, right, are some of the outcomes and impacts of the oppression from these institutions, right? So fat phobia, food insecurity, classism, anti-Semitism, climate change, ableism, ageism. When we say white supremacy, we're talking about the maintenance of control and power by cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and those who benefit most from that power. This means that there are barriers of access for people who identify as white also. Definitely wish I had more time to unpack this with you, but we have to move on. All right. So now we're going to do a little bit of a chronological deep dive, right? So we're going to look at how some things have happened in the past. Now, I will say that this is a bit heavy, and so this is an opportunity for you to be able to take care of yourself. I am going to kind of move quickly through it just because I want to be able to open up the floor and get to the place where you all can ask questions. But we're going to talk a little bit about the history of how things have happened in this country, right? Where we see medical and gender bias, where we see racism show up. And so all of these things are giving us a foundational understanding for activism and reform in ways that we can then work together to kind of reach racial and social justice. All right. So this is a timeline, right? And this kind of starts with the colonization and genocide and slavery. In 1869, obviously, there were thriving indigenous communities in what is now known as the United States. There were also thriving African communities across the continent of Africa. And this is when we see the beginning of chattel slavery or free labor here in the United States. We see the colonization of the Americas and the genocide of indigenous peoples in the United States. As you can see here, there is a resource alert. This is another book that you can look at to learn more about some of the things that we're talking about here. If we zoom out a bit, we can take a look at the purpose of enslavement, right? So the purpose of enslavement of Africans was purely economic. Slave labor was free for enslavers, and Black people were bred to create more laborers. Black birthing people were also used as wet nurse, which made them prioritize the feeding of their children, they're feeding the enslavers' children over their own. Right. And so this is where the moral backing for slavery, or the idea that it's okay to enslave other human beings, came from. It came from the concepts of racism, which again, I just want to remind you that this is, while racism is highly and well documented, this can also be applied to both homophobia and transphobia, which reinforce the ideas that Black people or trans people are less than human. Right? Throughout this timeline, you'll see some strategic acts that assert the power of white people over communities of color, like during this time and throughout American slavery. So if we move on a little bit forward, we'll get to see what happened or what has happened to the further mistreatment of Black bodies, right? So here in the United States, we see that personhood is counted at 3/5 of a person. Enslaved people were only counted as persons when useful for sustaining white supremacy, i.e. more voting power. So you see that reflected sometimes in more populous states having a larger representation in our Congress, and that's some of that relates back to the idea of those places having more slaves during that time, right? We see the launch of modern gynecology and experimentation on Black bodies by Dr. James Marion Sims, where he leased bodies in order to practice, although anesthesia at that point in time had been in existence and had been widely used. This also supported the publication of studies that incorrectly states that Black people feel less pain and have higher thresholds to pain. As we move along, we start to see some progress, but not a lot. Right? The 14th Amendment was adopted into the Constitution as one of the Reconstruction Amendments, and it asserted equal protection of the law. This is super important, as it was proposed in response to the issues that were related to former slaves following the American Civil War. Why this is important is because while the 14th Amendment was adopted to give equal protection under the law for people of color, so based upon race, this amendment would then be later leveraged to assert sex and gender equality. So here we have a picture of Miss Anna Pauli Murray, who was educated at Howard University, Black woman, and she wrote the groundbreaking legal opinion that then Ruth Bader Ginsburg used in 1971 to drive forward the landmark Supreme Court decision that prohibited deferential treatment based upon sex, i.e. equal protection under law. So moving a bit along, more systemic racism, right? So we're getting down into the later 1800s, early 1900s, right? So we see Jim Crow laws were enforced in the United States, legalizing racial education, significantly impacting schools, housing, transportation, public facilities. Again, these are all more systemic racism policies working together to impact people of color. And as some rights were restored through policy change, other policy changes were finding new ways to take equal rights away. Okay. We also happen to see the implementation of the practice of eugenics in the medical field, which at the time launched the beginning of the reproductive freedom movement and the founding of the Birth Control Federation of America, which supported reproductive justice by providing tools for folks to be able to manage their reproduction. These tools were leveraged by white and middle class and upper class women, birthing people, but were used against community of color. And we'll see how it's been used against communities of color and poor folks as a mechanism for them to be able to control overproduction in the later years. So more medical racism. This continues to build a foundation of medical mistrust within the Black community. And while we're no longer in a period of enslavement during the 1930s and 1970s, Black birthing people's bodies were still leased for experimentation. And it didn't stop with experimentation on Black communities without their consent. In 1932, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was launched by the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This was an unethical natural history study conducted between 1932 to 1972, so over a period of 40 years. Participants were promised free medical care and were instead infected with syphilis without their consent and without treatment. Moving on to the granny midwives, which I think is a really important piece of our history, right? So up until, the early 1900s, most people were delivered at home by midwives. And certainly in the South, the granny midwives were the folks who supported folks having their babies. In the same way that Indigenous people worked to maintain their cultural practices, Black folks supported birth in their communities throughout and after American slavery. Up until the mid-20th century, when obstetricians and hospitals became the primary location for deliveries, granny midwives provided most of the care for poor and rural pregnant people, both Black and white, throughout the South. These community midwives were phased out through the passing of new laws and policies, regulating the practice of medicine, of who could provide services like attending childbirth, through messaging campaigns that implied that midwives were uneducated, dirty, or even practicing witchcraft. By 1975, only 0.3% of all births were attended by a midwife outside of a hospital. By phasing them out, this pushed white dominant Western medical birthing practices, which subjugated Black and Indigenous practices. It enhanced business for doctors and nurses trained by formal institutions and displaced apprentice-trained, highly experienced midwives and doulas across communities. It removed women identifying folks from leadership role in birth, and due to lack of access to those institutions by women and people of color, as well as other marginalized communities. So this is Bridget Biddy Mason, who was a granny midwife. All right, so we're getting closer to the 90s, and then we're going to kind of move through this, right? So systemic oppression, still not an issue of the past, right? We see the Norplant contraceptive was launched and marketed to women on welfare with a focus on Black birthing people as a means to be able to, in order to receive public benefits, to control their fertility. And so this is a very strong example of systemic oppression. Specifically, people were forced to be on birth control in order to receive benefits to thwart poverty. And this poverty largely impacted people of color and rural white communities of birthing people. It served as a mechanism to minimize the population of target populations and disproportionately impacted people of color. It's often seen as a mechanism to maintain voting power in the hands of rich white citizens. Right? We see the Affordable Care Act being passed. We see the increase in the heights and peaks of the Black Lives Matter movement. And all the while, we still are continuing to fight for rights for people to make decisions over their own bodies, right? For instance, the Texas 6-week ban on abortion ban. All right, so let's talk about the impact. And this is a review of just a couple of current statistics to provide some additional context of how the things that have happened in the chronology are impacting us today, right? So, as we mentioned, race is the biggest indicator for birth-related outcomes, specifically being Black in the United States is a leading indicator for birth-related complications, right? Black women and birthing people in the US are 243% more likely to die from pregnancy and or childbirth-related issues than their white counterparts, and that's regardless of socioeconomic status. Now, let's take some action and talk a little bit about allyship and advocacy and how we can move towards using some of the information that we've used today in service of the people that we serve. So, allyship, it's an aspirational term. It is not self-defined. Usually the work and efforts must be recognized by those you are seeking to ally with or be affirmed by. It's ongoing, a lifelong process of building relationships that are built on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals or marginalized groups of people. And it's not always public. Advocacy, on the other hand, is public support for a cause, policy, or person. Health professionals serve as advocates for their clients all the time, right? Whether you're an ally or an advocate, we hope that you'll be applying this anti-racist lens, right? This lens of social justice and equity for all to your practice. Incorporating gender fluidity and queerness practices to your work so that all feel included and it feels inclusive. All right, part of that is acknowledge your perspective. What's your social location? And this includes being race explicit, right? So, you know, saying as a white person, as a able-bodied person, as a female, as a male, as a non-binary person, right? Insert your descriptor here. You may want to include other identities or areas of privilege that you hold or possess. Acknowledging your privilege is super important because it allows everyone to know where your point of view is, or the locus of where you're speaking from, and you know, it's widely acknowledged what you may know or what you don't know, right? Or where your biases lie. Be reflective and introspective. Work to understand your privilege and your perspective in an ongoing way. That comes through acknowledging how your personal experiences may influence you, both positively and negatively. Remember that context may change the privilege that you hold, right? So depending on where you are in the room, right? Not every person who identifies a specific identity has the same experience, right? I think one that's pretty widely or easily, you know, viewed here is that, you know, not all white people are the same. Not all Black people are the same. Folks come from different ethnic backgrounds. People come from maybe their experience as a first generation, or maybe they may be newly immigrated to this country. And so their experiences might be different. Practice active listening and ensure alignment with action. All right, so you'll want to listen to the needs of your client or your patient, believe them, believe their lived experiences, provide wait time to make sure that like your patient or your client doesn't feel rushed. A lot of times, especially when you are in a situation, you kind of hold a little bit of the power and privilege in the room just based upon the fact that like what your role is. Whatever training or information that you may have that the person who is coming to you you are looked at as the expert holder, right? And so giving an opportunity for them to be able to digest what's been said and then also ask questions or feel comfortable to ask questions. Check for their understanding of the material you've shared and or the context that was shared by the doctor or nurse that may be leading to a decision. Check for your own understanding of their response to a question or a need that they have expressed. Work to meet the needs of the person expressed by the birthing person or baby that you are working to support. Shifting power and amplifying voices, right? Actively share the power you have as a health professional. Share the evidence-based knowledge that you have. Repeat, reinforce their wishes to amplify their voice so that what they're saying is being repeated and that they actually hear it being said out loud. Center the voice of your patient always. That's so important. I think people like to be heard. They like to be seen. They want to be acknowledged. It's super important to just be in a position where, as the patient, they are able to make decisions for themselves and feel trusted by their healthcare provider. You can do that simply by repeating what they have said or allowing them to ask questions and creating that safe space for them. You're going to want to balance the inner work and the outer work, right? That helps you to be authentic in your practice. So continuing the work to understand systemic oppression and its impacts on this on the intersectional identities of your patients, right? So like, what does that look like? Right? If you have someone who's in front of you and they're sharing with you some of the struggles that you may or may not have the depth of understanding or even all of the context, right? Being open to wanting to learn about that and asking questions, if they're able to share with you, but doing some of your own work and understanding that while systems create more oppression, that folks may be dealing with more than things that you just see on the outside, right? It's more than just racism. They may have a gender or sexual identity that also makes them at risk or puts them in a place where they are experiencing oppression as a result of. Diversify who you learn from. I can't stress this enough. I think there are lots of people who are in the field who are very well known, right? And we respect them for their work. And sometimes we put them in a position where they are held very highly with high regard, as they should be. But there are also people whose voices are not heard, who have lived experiences, who do great work, who aren't as amplified. And those are people that you should seek to learn from. Just because everybody's learning from this one person in the field doesn't mean that there aren't other perspectives that may say similar or different things. So diversifying who you learn from not only uplifts, right, and amplifies the voices of those who might be on the margins, but it also gives you a spread of different people to be able to learn from. Lean into the discomfort of understanding that this is a system that sometimes uses us to perpetuate it. Ask yourself how you contribute to it and perpetuate it. This also includes internalized oppression and superiority. For those of us that are working in large systems, right? Like maybe you work in the education system, maybe you work in the healthcare system. Like systems do operate off of, at times, white supremacy. And so there are larger systems of oppression that exist. And despite wanting to do good work and feeling like you are a good person, right? These things exist outside of us. And so leaning into that and understanding that, but then figuring out like, what is the work that you need to do or what is the work that you can do in service of your client to be able to break down some of those barriers. Thank you. So that is the close of my presentation today. I do want to open it up. I know that there were a lot of things that I wanted to get through, and I wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to cover it all. And so I'm curious if there are any questions or if there are any things that folks would like for me to be able to kind of talk or expand on for today. I can't see anyone, and I can't. If anyone's looking at me or if anyone has any questions, I don't see anything.
feel free to either come off mute to share your questions, or you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. But thank you, Stephanie. That was an amazing presentation. I really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing it with us today. I don't see any questions just yet. We'll give just a few more minutes. I guess one question that I would have is, how have you seen the topics that you talked about today? I guess where the intersectionality between that and the 2SLGBTQI plus community, and
Mhm.
particularly as they're going through their family building and options.
Absolutely. So, I mean, where do we start with that, right? So, communities of color and those who find themselves in the LGBTQIA plus face very similar struggles, right? Oftentimes fighting for basic human rights, challenging dominant norms, seeking representation, visibility. When you start to talk about that in how folks are creating and making their families, right? Like, the access just oftentimes just doesn't exist, right? And if it does exist, it comes with medical bias and or gender bias for some folks. So as we see racial justice and gender and sexuality equality, both of them are very much so connected, deeply interconnected. And so those are some of the ways that some of the things that we see. I mean, I know that my focus was a bit heavy on race, but I think that that's because it's largely documented and something that I think a lot of us see very easily. However, as I mentioned, gender and sexuality flow right within that vein. Folks aren't documenting like who folks are in relationship with or what folks' sexuality is or are. We're seeing more of it certainly in the last 50 years or so. But there's shared struggles there.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions for Stephanie?
Hi, Elaine. Thank you for raising your hand.
You can go right ahead. Do you want to come off mute, Elaine?
Yep, sorry. It took me a second. Let me see. Okay, here I am. I might have missed it. I was gonna ask you about doulas and uh at the health department we're promoting doulas and the new Medicaid benefit, and I'm not sure if I just wanted to see what your thoughts were about that, and I might have also missed it. Sorry if I did.
So there were some mention of doulas throughout the presentation, and that's largely because we talk about that being as an Indigenous practice, right? In terms of the new Medicaid project, I'm curious what your question is specifically to that.
I'm not sure. I had some distractions during the presentation, so I think maybe my best bet is since it's recorded, I'll rewatch. I'm sorry
So it wasn't
I
something
missed.
that's okay. So it wasn't something that was specifically mentioned, but I think if your question is like, are they useful? Are they helpful? Are they um I think that it's definitely something that we have seen that having the presence of a doula has decreased maternal mortality and increased birth outcomes, particularly for women of color. And so I know that is something that the new Medicaid doula project is aimed towards doing, to helping support with reducing the maternal mortality for Black women in the United States. There's certainly a crisis with that, and there are a lot of things that are interplaying, which impact those birth outcomes for Black folks.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm interested in in best ways to help people get access to doulas too. And I think that's going to be an ongoing process.
For sure, for sure. I think that that is definitely something that's going to be an ongoing process, but you can do something as simple as like Googling and searching your, if there's any local doula collectives that are within your community, that often support with that work.
Thank
And
you.
So Featherstone has also dropped in the chat that, you know, I don't know if we have any data on the effect of doulas with the outcomes in queer families in particular. And I think, and I don't know that we have any documented, which again goes back to, you know, the invisibility oftentimes, sometimes of these, or the erasure of these identities, oftentimes due to, you know, highlighting other things that are more easily visible. And so I'd be willing to guess. I'll go out and say it, right? Like, and also I am a doula, so I'm certainly biased. Doulas do impact and have a positive impact on birth outcomes. And so I'd imagine that we could probably see that there are certainly some positive outcomes for queer families that have utilized a doula during their birthing experiences.
And we have a question in the Q&A. If you had to choose a book to start a book club on this topic, which one would you pick?
Oh, you know what? I think if we go to my next slide, I have a few recommendations here. Not that I thought that question was going to come up, but these are all books that have informed some of this work that I have done here. And these are all like my favorites. If I were to start read one, I would say Killing the Black Body is probably my favorite.
Great. I am actually going to stop our